Welcome to the first class in 3D modeling. And the reason why I've structured it this way to have 3D modeling at the beginning of this complete beginners series is because simply we need something to work with later. So we might as well learn modeling up front at the beginning so that we can use models later down the course and have an understanding of what modeling is and why it's important. So to get going, I wanted first to describe some concepts about 3D modeling so you can begin to understand how to approach 3D modeling kind of from a theoretical standpoint so that you know what tools to use and how to approach whatever project that you come up with in your imagination and projects down the line and all that kind of a thing. So let's take a look at an example that I've created. All of these scene files that I'm working in are available to you for downloads. So this one might not be that useful because it's pretty basic, but it's going to be made available to you to download so you can follow along or open it up and dissect it and see what is inside. So I'm going to show you an example that I made real quick so we can cover two important concepts: hard versus organic modeling. So when I first described this, you can probably already guess what it means, especially by looking at these two examples. And let me first quickly cover a couple little tricks that I like to use in Maya Viewport so we can look at this a little better. I don't know if it shows up in your video, but the edges of all of these polygons are not super smooth. They're kind of jagged and they're not anti-aliased, as we like to say technically. So there's actually an anti-alias button here that you can turn on for the viewport, and it is this little one right here. If I hover over it, and you can look at the bottom left, and it says multi-sample anti-aliasing, and then the tooltip will also pop up. So if we press that, and you can follow along and do this in your viewport, you can see that this is just for us. This doesn't affect the final render or the model itself or anything like that. This is just kind of to make it easier on our eyes as we're using Maya. So I like to turn on anti-aliasing, and I also like to turn on the ambient occlusion because you can't really see where these lines and gaps intersect on this model very well. So if we turn on ambient occlusion, watch this area right here where there should be lines popping up, but we can't see them because they're all facing the same direction. That's just how Maya is rendering it in the viewport. If we turn on ambient occlusion, which is this little button up here, which is just next to the anti-aliasing, we get ambient occlusion, which basically shows us areas of geometry that are close together and darkens those corners and inset areas. So now we can see that model a little bit better now that we have those two kind of viewport options turned on. So back to the topic at hand, hard versus organic models and modeling. And why is this important? It's important because we need to understand how we're going to approach a project or a model and the tools we're going to use to create it. So let's first talk about what hard versus organic really means. So you can kind of get an idea from these two examples. Hard is kind of straight surfaces. They can be curved as well. You can see there's a cylinder here, so it has a rounded surface on that side. But there's patterns here. It's things, mechanical things, things that are bolted together and made by humans typically are hard surfaces. So imagine a transformer here. And the organic shape on the right, there's no pattern really here. There's a lot of kind of swooping shapes, and it was made clearly not in the same way or with the same tools that the one on the left was made. You can see there's two very different type of models here. And just to kind of drive this point home, it's probably already pretty clear what these two things are, but it's good to just drive it home at this early stage of learning about modeling. So I have a couple pictures here that I wanted to show you. Just take a guess at what this would be, hard or organic models. And you can kind of tell it's an organic kind of shape. There's a lot of branches and fine texture and bark and leaves. And so, of course, this is going to be organic. And the type of tools we'll use to model something like this will be much different than modeling a hard surface, like me wearing the Darth Vader helmet. It has some curved shape to it, but it's a hard surface. There's not fine detail and texture on the surface itself for the most part. It's glossy, it's like a hard plastic. But if we're looking at this and looking at my hand, the hand would be an organic model because it has very unique shapes. There's no pattern or uniformity to it at all. So it depends on what we're looking at in this picture, if it's my hand or the helmet, on what's going to be organic or considered hard surface. And just as another example, here are some more helmets that are all hard surface models. And for a kind of more historical example, you can see there's both in this as well. The kind of statues in the middle, in the foreground, and the inset on these at the front of this building are organic models. They have musculature, they have, flowing robes, and there's horses. But when you look at the building itself, it has very flat surfaces, very smooth. There's no, kind of organic detail unless we look at the top of the columns. We can see the kind of floral patterns that are incorporated there. So this is, again, marrying those two types of models in one example. So this is also a famous sculpture that's in the Vatican. And you can see the robes and all that type of thing would be considered organic, even though, organic, you might think of like nature or something like that. Clothes can be considered organic because they have these kind of flowing, irregular shapes in the folds of the model. And again, lastly, we have both together where this kind of structure on top of the mountain is a hard surface. And then when we look at the rock, we can clearly tell the difference between the pattern and the type of surface that this building is versus the kind of irregular surface of the rock. Okay, so I think we understand what hard versus organic means. And I meant to mess with this little cluster handle to show you also that, this is important to understand for later down the road when we're talking about rigging and animating. If it's a hard surface, we're probably not going to flex from the middle of this object. It's probably going to move all together, and that's going to, affect how we're going to do things later with rigging and animation. Whereas if it's organic, this thing could move all kinds of different ways, and we would need to rig and animate to reflect the type of organism this is, or shape, or model. So it's also important to understand later on what this implies for other aspects. So in this course, now we're going to jump into actually making things now that you have an understanding of how to use Maya's interface and how we're going to approach modeling. We're going to make one hard surface model that we're going to continue to use throughout the course, and then we're going to model an organic character, a skeleton guy that we're going to use to animate later and make a pretty cool animation. So follow along in the next lesson and we'll get to creating stuff now. Thanks for watching. Welcome to this 3D modeling class where we will create a Ghostbuster trap so we can start to learn the 3D modeling tools inside of Maya. Anytime you start modeling something, you want to look at reference. In case you don't know what a Ghostbuster trap is, you can just Google it and find some images. And we're going to use this just as a template, not really as an exact match that we're going to try to get, but just, there's a kind of box here that has different knobs and a handle on it and that kind of a thing. And that's kind of the general kind of direction we're going to try to model this object in so we can start to learn some Maya. So I'm going to switch back to Maya. And anytime you start using Maya, you want to set your project. This is something to remember from here on out. This isn't just some thing that, you want to do sometimes. This is, from day one when I was learning Maya till you work in a big studio, you want to set your project. Big studios have their own way of doing stuff, but a small studio maybe, you want to set your project. If you go to File, we'll go down to Set Project. And the reason this is important is because anytime you have, later down the road, you have textures, say you're doing a cloth simulation and you want to cache that out, or all these other technical things that we'll get into later, we need somewhere for Maya to save all those things to reference into the scene. So in my directory, I've made a Maya folder and I'm going to set that. And it will ask you to create a default workspace. And typically this just means, it's going to save, kind of unimportant stuff like what kind of view did you have open? Was it a perspective or a side view? And, what kind of preferences maybe you had for that workspace. So you can just say create default workspace, and you won't have to do that again. You'll have to do that the first time you set a project. We're also going to go to the project window, the other option here under project. You can see project in gray. We only have two options. We've already done set project. The project is set. So let's go to project window, and we get all of these different folder options here. And if you don't see these names typed out here, you can go to edit, reset settings, and it should fill all of those out for you. And this will create folders, like I mentioned a moment ago, for caches, for images, and mostly we're going to be using for scenes, because when we save a Maya file, if we just hit Command S like you would in a Word document or whatever, just to save the file, it's going to save a .mb or a .ma. And that's M for Maya and A or B, depending on if you save an ASCII or a binary file. But that's not that important right now. Let's just hit accept, and it'll make all these folders. So when we go to file save, let's go file save scene, and because we haven't done it yet, it'll open up this dialog box. And now we have this current project. It knows where our current project is, and we have all those folders that it had listed out. And anytime we're saving a scene, we want to save it in the scenes folder. And you can see that it is under our project that I defined as Maya. And now I can name it whatever I want, and I can choose to be an ASCII or a binary. And it doesn't really matter, to be honest, for our purposes. So I'm going to name that Ghostbuster Trap and hit save. So now we have the project saved, and that way if we need to move the project to another computer, it will have reference a path to the project settings, so it'll know where the textures are or anything else like that. So let's get started and model this Ghostbuster Trap. So let's take a look at this reference, and we basically have a rectangle with a cylinder handle. So let's start with the most basic elements first, and then we'll add detail later. Because anytime you do modeling, whether it's hard or organic, let's start with the simplest shapes first and then add detail later. We don't want to start with the detail on really anything. And that goes, the same is true for animation. Most art, you start with the basics first. So let's create the rectangle and the handle, because those are the biggest, most obvious things. So in Maya, there's a couple different ways we can create things. We have this shelf here, the poly modeling shelf. And there are curves and surfaces here, which, it looks like they have similar things, but these are called Nurbs Surfaces. And these aren't very useful for modeling and animation. They sometimes are used for kind of just to create controls on rigs, to create paths to revolve a shape around, or constrain a camera to a path, or fly a plane down a curve path, something like that. But for our purposes, we're not going to be using Nurbs surfaces. We're going to be doing poly modeling, where we have vertices, edges, and faces. So let's create the rectangle. We can click this rectangle right here and zoom in by right-clicking and holding down Alt and left-clicking to rotate around, if you remember. We could also create that by doing the polygon primitives, and we could pop this off if we wanted to and create a bunch of these cubes. That's another way to do it. But now that we have this, we can go over to our channel box here, and we can see we have a polycube 1. And we can see it's called pcube 1 here, and it's also called pcube 1 here, and it's highlighted, so we know this is what's highlighted. And I point out these things because, we can translate this thing around different ways, and that's reflected here. But there's also other options. When we pop this down, we can get subdivisions. So if we wanted more subdivisions, we can go to subdivision width, height, and depth, and those will do different kind of dimensions on this, depending on if we need more geometry. But we'll get to that in a minute. Let's first make the basic shape. So I'll go to width, and I'll make this a little longer and a little wider and tall. So now we have something that approximates the size, and I'm going to go ahead and turn on the anti-aliasing and the ambient occlusion to help us visualize this. I'm also going to lift this up, and we can see depending on the width, height, and depth, if I just change this to 5 and these to 2, then I know the height is 2, that this needs to go up 1 to be sitting right on the floor, right? Because it's measuring from the center. Wherever our manipulator is, that's where it's measuring from. So if it's a height of 2 and this is in the middle, then it's 1 to the floor, right? From where the manipulator is. If we bring this down to the floor, it's going to be at 0. So that's one way to kind of know how it's calculating what these numbers are exactly. So we have that rectangle. Now let's create the handle. We can click the cylinder here and drag this up. You can hit W if you don't have the manipulator selected yet. You can hit E to rotate this over. And to get it exact, we can just type in 90. You can do -90 or 90. For us, it doesn't really matter right now. And we could scale this down, or we could use, similarly, these types of attributes over here. So we could reduce the radius, or we could, just scale it down with the scale tool by hitting R. And let's move this to one side and move it up. And then we can make another cube a couple different ways. We could duplicate this one. We could hit Command D, and now we have another one that we can scale and do all these things to. But you can see when you duplicate, just with the shortcut, you don't have that option anymore, right? We don't have that polycube input that we had here. So sometimes it's nice to just use the basic tools to make sure that we have this history here that later we can go back in and change if we want to. So let's bring this here and scale it down a little bit. And let's talk about some ways to align things. So, if we wanted to get this to be exactly on this edge, it might be kind of hard to use the manipulator, back and forth. There are a couple different things we can do to move things around and be very specific. Of course, we can go up here and type in a number, but we could just be typing all day and, we might not get exactly visually what it looks like. So to know that we have snapped to that, we can use the snapping tools. But the snapping tools go based off of where the manipulator is. So, for example, if I hold down V on the keyboard, that means vertice. It's going to snap to vertice. And just to show you what were the components that we're dealing with, to know what a vertice even is, let me break this down even further. So if we take this square, I'm just going to isolate it with this little button here, Isolate Select. I right click. Now I can see and change my selection mode to edge, vertex, vertex face, face, or back to object mode, which is what we're currently in. We're in object mode. That's also denoted by this little button up here in the top left. If we want to go to component mode, we can click this button. And again, it'll show that if you hold it down, or if you hover over it rather. And you can see the different kind of components that we can select here. And we can isolate those. So now we're selecting the lines. Or if we go back to this one and deselect the line, we get the vertice. So now we can edit the basic components of all the polygons here. And if we want to do this quickly, we can right click and hold, drag up and go to edge mode now. And now we can adjust the edges. So that just gives you a quick idea of what the components are that make up a polygon. So I just went to object mode to get back in so I can select the whole thing. I could also go up here and click this middle button to go back into object mode. I'm going to unisolate this now so we can go back to our model. So the next thing we need to understand is how to change where the manipulator is. So if I hold down V like I was describing earlier, and I middle mouse drag, if we click and hold on middle mouse, this is going to snap to vertices. You can see it's trying to snap to the corners of the box or the vertices of the cylinder. So, but we don't want the center to snap to it. We want the edge to snap to it. So we're going to need to change where this center pivot is. To do that, we can hold down D. And now we get a different type of manipulator here. And if we hold down V while we're holding down D, we can also snap the pivot to a vertice without the object moving, because we're just changing where the pivot is now. So if I let go of both, now we get the regular manipulator. If this doesn't come back, you can hit W to make sure that pops back to be the manipulator. So now when we move this, the whole thing moves around. Now what we can do is go and hold down V and middle mouse drag and isolate the up value. So we're only going to go up, and you can see it snapped upward. Now we can hold down the X axis and it will snap to the backside, which it seems like it has. So now we don't want this pivot here anymore. How do we get that back? That's not a big deal. We go to Modify and we go down to Center Pivot. When we click this, now the pivot is back in the center, and we can move the pivot around later again if we want to, but now it's there. Also remember, you can see that the axis here is yellow. So if I was to start middle mouse dragging, it's going to be isolated on this no matter what I do or where I move my mouse, if it's middle mouse dragged. So, you just want to make sure that you understand how it's isolating these axes as you click them. That's one thing that, stumps a lot of people when they're just starting out, like, why can't I move this in a different axis? It's because we, selected that one and now it's thinking we want to isolate that. So this looks very basic right now, but I want to give you a quick introduction into how to create things, manipulate them, snap things around. And in the next lesson, we're going to take this further and start adding details and learn a few more modeling tools inside of Maya. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Welcome to this lesson where we will continue making the Ghostbuster trap and learn a lot of new tools. So now that we have the basic shape done, let's choose a view and a piece of reference to try to add more detail in. So let's go back to our reference and look at a view like this. So I like to move my viewport to get a closer view of what the reference view is like. So it's kind of a 3/4 angle like this. Let's focus on this edge here, where there's a lower level here, and then it goes up, and there's a bevel. There's a bevel here as well, and then it goes out. So we have this higher kind of rim and a lower area here. And it looks like the back area here is at the same level as this edge here. So let's just focus on that. Anytime you have reference in something that's kind of complicated, you're going to break it down into its components and simplify it and only work on little sections like that at a time. So let's do this kind of edge here. So I'm going to go back in, and if I go into my face mode, right clicking and going down to face, I select that and move it around, I can't really move this and divide this in different sections. So I need edge loops here. And that's, if we go into edge mode, right clicking and dragging up, I can move individual edges. Well, we need more of those. We need an edge here to get that border. We need 2 edges here so that we can divide this section in half and it kind of have an angle between it. So let's add more edges. So to do that, we need to go to Mesh Tools, Insert Edge Loop. And what I like to do is to add tools that I'm going to use a lot to my custom shelf. So let's move over to our custom shelf and go down to the mesh tools and hold down Command and Shift, and then click Insert Edge Loop and watch your custom shelf. Boom. We get a new tool here so that now we don't have to keep going back to this menu. And if you do this by accident in the future, or you just want to delete it, you can right click and go to delete. So let's click that. And if we click and drag this, we can kind of make these 2 kind of areas where we're going to have the lower section and the upper section, and we have this angle here. So we need to have 2 edge loops, one here and one there.